Okay, I think we're good now.
Yeah, I think we might be good.
All right. Okay, Skip, take it
All
away.
right. Yeah, thank you. Thank you everybody for having me. I'm really looking forward to this talk. I've done this talk a few times, but since the pandemic, haven't been able to do any public speaking, obviously. So this is a great opportunity, and hopefully everybody takes some good notes away from this. And we'll try to have some questions at the end. So if you have any questions, try to save them, and then we can touch base once we wrap through the presentation. So. Um, Again, thank you guys for having me. My name is Skip Healy, and I'm the owner of Change of Greenery LLC. We're going to go over some plants that can help with reducing the amount of turf that is needed in one's yard, whether those are through ground covers or creating beds and using native plants within those beds. We'll touch base on a few different techniques as well. So we'll go ahead and jump right in. This photo that you're seeing behind you is a residence in Melbourne on the Indian River Lagoon. My background is actually at the same residence. The ground cover that you see there is what they call sunshine mimosa, and we'll touch base on that one in just a few slides. So ready to get going, Joyce. All right, so some of the benefits of reducing turf, we're in a place where St. Augustine turf does require a lot of care, from irrigation to mowing to pesticides and herbicides to just kind of keep things green, lush, and healthy. So by putting a lot of fertilizer on these turf areas, we're really contributing to the algae blooms in the lagoon through runoff. So many of you may know that in Brevard County, we have a window in, I think it's from April through October, to where we're not supposed to put down high phosphorus fertilizers, and that's mainly to help with the lagoon health. So we're all connected to the same watershed. Wherever your gutters are at the end of your driveway, all lead to a system of canals that end up in the Indian River Lagoon. So everything from washing your car in your driveway, having an oil spill, all sorts of things are factors in lagoon health. So another reason that we like to reduce the amount of turf is through habitat loss. If you think about turf grass, it's a monoculture. So, you only have that one species growing. So with that, you really are not providing a lot of habitat through this turf grass. So by using some of these different native ground covers, you're not only supporting pollinators, you're supporting butterflies, even small mammals and things too. So when they clear cut an area, like, for these newer subdivisions and HOAs and things, we're driving a lot of habitat out. So one thing we can do to kind of combat that is to bring more habitat in through pollinators, et cetera. So another thing is the wetland loss. So a lot of these neighborhoods out in Vieira used to be a swamp, essentially. So by bringing some of those native plants back, we can help support some of the deer and things that have been driven out as well. And water use is a big factor as well. So it takes many hundreds of thousands of gallons to irrigate your typical St. Augustine lawn throughout a month or so. So by planting some of these native ground covers that really just need water upon establishment, you can reduce that amount of irrigation, which also saves you a bill. But not only that, it's in the future, we may be in a war on water. So, we're reducing that water use currently, even if it is reclaimed or from a well, just not having to irrigate as often is a great attribute to native landscapes. And maintenance. So, some of these ground covers, they might only need mowed once to twice a year, and just need to be weed whipped off your driveway to keep it aesthetically pleasing. So, this is something that a lot of people can do themselves. And if not, it's at least reducing the amount of time that a lawn crew would need to spend with care. So, all right, I think we're ready to go. So this picture is actually the same picture that's behind me, except from a different angle of the yard. So one of the native ground covers that I mentioned in the beginning is sunshine mimosa. This is this ground cover you see with the pink powder puff flowers. They almost look like the Lorax tree from Dr. Seuss or something like that. Have a nice little fern-like foliage to them. So they are actually in a species of plant, mimosa, that's the genus, that is a bit sensitive. So when you walk on it, they actually will fold up their leaves a bit, which is fun for kids and things like that. But it's a defense mechanism against critters and things from stomping on them too hard. But it creates a nice lush ground cover, and you can walk on it. You can walk your dog on it. It's very salt tolerant, and is also nitrogen fixing. So if you plant this around a fruit tree or something like that that needs a little more fertilizer, this ground cover can help with that and reduce the amount of fertilizer that you would have to put on. It has roots that it puts out at every leaf node, and those roots contain little nodes on the ends that help bring out more nitrogen in the soil. So if you want to just go through those bullet points, I want to see if there's anything I missed on there. Very pollinator friendly. So these flowers, if you go back to those pink flowers, they are the first thing that most pollinators would find in the morning. So they'll just be blooming throughout the morning and kind of fade into the afternoon. So this picture was taken roughly around 11 a.m. But it's a great ground cover for beachside residents because it can handle that salt. It needs a sandy, well-drained soil and lots of sun. So this isn't one that I would plant right under the oak tree. It just wouldn't be as full as it would in a situation like you see here. All right, this next one is a fun one. It was actually on a couple slides earlier mixed in with another ground cover as well. This one's called frog fruit, Phyllonotiflora. So it's also called turkey tangle, creeping Charlie is another nickname, but Phyllonotiflora is the genus and species. And if you look at that species name, notiflora, so on these nodes, on these leaf nodes that it puts out, that's generally where it's going to send up the flowers as well. So these are little matchstick-like flowers you can kind of see down in there that have a little purple and white hue to them. This is a host plant for the white peacock butterfly, which is an amazing little butterfly. So this is its host plant. It will lay its eggs, and it will also nectar on these flowers as well. This is a plant that a lot of folks, if you have a mixed lawn, kind of a lawn that has bahia grass and some other kind of seasonal ground covers that appear, oftentimes this is one that finds its way in, and it's a great one to encourage if you do have it, just by weeding some of the other things around it so that it can fill in. But oftentimes it will grow amongst other grasses too, so it can be mowed. You can weed whack it really easily, but in general it's a really easy one to care for. So it is soil versatile. You'll see it growing on the edges of banks for canals, all the way into kind of sandy soils. So it can handle a little bit more dappled light than the sunshine mimosa, but it would prefer to be in full sun. That's where it's going to be the fullest. So this next one is called twin flower. There's two twin flower species that I would like to talk about. One is the Discaristae oblongifolia. The other is Humistrata. The oblongifolia is going to be better for a sandier environment, a beachside environment, whereas the Humistrata would be fine in kind of a less well-drained soil. They're both very pollinator friendly. They're host plants to the buckeye butterflies, the common buckeyes. You can see these little purple flowers that they put out. And this one is actually a lot more shade tolerant than the last two that I mentioned. So if you do have an area that's near dappled light from a overstory tree like an oak or something like that, this is a good one to plug in. Not as quick to fill out as the other two are, but holds its shape really well, and is a great little ground cover. You can mow this one as well. You can weed whack it. So it's one that, you know, when you do have a shady situation, sometimes it's tough to find that right plant for the right place. twin flower may be that solution for folks that are dealing with that. So this next one's gopher apple. This is one that, it is technically a ground cover, but it does get a little bit more woody at the base. It can be mowed. Oftentimes you see it growing wild in kind of a mass planting of itself where it's just established. Generally, when I see it, it's closer to like US 1 Riverside areas that are just kind of being naturally maintained. In the name, you can see it's a great not host plant, but a wildlife source for gopher tortoises. That's how it gets its name, gopher apple. These little flowers would put out a little fruit that's roughly the size of a quarter that gopher tortoises do enjoy. Other small mammals do as well. It's listed as not very salt tolerant, but you can get away with it if you are on the beach side in certain areas. We all have our own little microclimates within our yards, and we know, our north side may be a little bit different than our south side of our house. So just finding that kind of nice area for it to fit in if this is the solution for you. But just do be aware that it will get a little bit more woody than the others would, but it's a great one for providing habitat. Really likes the well-drained soils and full sun. So that's kind of the ideal climate for that one there. But you would be benefiting a lot of gopher tortoises if you have those in your area. So this next ground cover we're going to talk about is kind of hard to see in this picture that I took. It's mixed in with another ground cover called railroad vine that we'll touch on in just a minute. But sea purslane is a great little ground cover for dune stabilization. It grows right on the dune of the beach, right on the dunes of the canals and things in the river. So this is one that humans and manatees could eat. It's got a salty flavor to it. It's a little green leaf, similar to like the portulacas or purslanes that you may be familiar with. And it, like those others that I've shown you, roots right on its internode. So wherever it sends out a leaf, it's going to put out a root. So you can see in this picture, we had a mom and baby manatee calf come up to one of our clients' houses on the canals in Tortoise Island and start munching away on the railroad vine and on the sea purslane. So because it does root right on that internode, it's great for dune stabilization and great for bank stabilization. Very highly salt tolerant, and it can take that really dry condition, but it can also take a flood, which is important for houses on the canals. Prefers full sun, but as you can see in this picture, it's still growing well in some dappled light under an oak tree. So this is the ground cover that we just saw in the other account mixed in with the sea purslane. Here it's kind of on its own, doing its job, stabilizing this bank of coquina rocks that's kind of the living shoreline between the property line and the Indian River Lagoon. So this is a plant, railroad vine, that's in the genus of sweet potatoes, morning glory, the Ipomea. So it does have a beautiful purple morning glory like flower to it. It grows right on the dune of the beach. You'll usually see it a little further south in Melbourne Beach. Very showy flowers and foliage. The foliage can be about 2 to 3 inches long and about 2 inches wide. And this one again will root right on its leaf. So it's great for holding in areas, but you can use this in your yard as well. But if you did choose to do that, just make sure it's an area that's not too close to like the street or anything like that, because it gets a little bit of a wild habit to it and will find its way wherever it needs to go. So make sure you have the space for this one if that's a plant you want to use. But if you do live on the lagoon, this is one that you will have manatees coming up and benefiting from you having this, and your dunes will definitely benefit from you having this plant as well. So very highly salt tolerant, can really take a beating in the full sun, can also take a flood as well. So it's a good one to have. So this is a fun little ground cover. This picture was actually taken in my yard, and this ground cover is called Coastal Ambrosia, Ambrosia hispida. It's got a really unique foliage to it. You can see it kind of reminds me of like the scented geraniums and the citronelle plants. Doesn't have that fragrance to it like some of those do, but it does have a nice little soft foliage to it. It's moderately salt tolerant, but this one grows even wild on some of the islands in the Indian River Lagoon that have been dredged up for the canals. Some of those islands that are in the center out there between the channels. This one grows pretty much beachside up to the dune. It's not going to want to necessarily be right on the dune of the beach, but it really likes that dry sandy soil and takes a full sun condition. It doesn't get very tall. You can see kind of the main stem down on the bottom there. If that's attached to the ground, it's going to stay low, but it will climb a plant too. So if you have anything near it, it will find its way up a little bit, and that just takes a little bit of pruning to get it back down on the ground. This one is associated with allergies. It's in the ambrosia genus, which is commonly known as the ragweed genus. So, if it doesn't affect you, then, it's great. Like I said, this one's in my front yard. I've never been affected by it personally, but if you do know you have ragweed allergies, this is maybe one to steer clear of. All right, this is another fun one. This is an account that we take care of kind of on a quarterly basis in Rockledge on Rockledge Drive. If you look down at the bottom of this picture, it is the plant that we were talking about, Salvia macella, aka river sage. It's got a nice little blue flower to it. It's got that typical salvia smell to the foliage, very herby, kind of earthy smell, but very pleasant. It's not highly salt tolerant, but I have planted this on the beach side with success, not directly on the beach, but on the other side of A1A, it can do just fine. But it is going to prefer a little bit more of a dappled light situation to a full sun situation. So again, like the twin flower, if this is a solution you've been looking for to try to fill in with a ground cover underneath an oak or a hardwood tree, where you have a lot of shade for most of the year, river sage is a great one. It makes a nice big swath depending on how you plant it, but it can be planted intermittently too. Does prefer that sandy soil to some of the tougher clays and things like that are in the newer developments, but it's a great one to kind of interplant amongst other ground covers too. It works well with twin flower being planted around it, or some of the other grasses and things. All right, so blue-eyed grass. Blue-eyed grass is a fun little grass that's more of a ground cover than it is like a clumping grass, but it has this clumping habit to it, similar to an iris. Flat blades to the grass, kind of in a corkscrew pattern from the base. It's listed as not very salt tolerant, but again, with kind of microclimates within your yard, you might be able to find a spot that works well for it. It does have these showy little flowers on it. And this is one that oftentimes you won't notice until the blooming season, which is, it's kind of early spring, late winter. And sometimes you'll see this one roadside blooming and just gets mowed occasionally. So it is one you can mow, and it's one that the pollinators absolutely love as well. So, and it is soil versatile. So you'll see it on the banks of canals, out inland towards like 95, all the way through US 1. So. All right, so we're going to talk about a couple wildflower options for ground covers. Some of these aren't as dense as the other ones that we've talked about. They don't necessarily make like a blanket style of like a turf would necessarily, but if you plant these dense enough, they can fill in and almost create sort of a pseudo ground cover situation. So ones we like to use to kind of fill in these spots, if we were planting river sage or twin flower, wild petunia is a great one, another one for the shade. It's related to the Mexican petunia and all the other petunias, so don't let the genus scare you, the Ruellia, but it's caroliniensis. And this one's going to have a nice small little petunia flower on it, kind of a light purple to it. The wild violet is another one that you can mix in. It's not necessarily going to make a dense ground cover, but it can fill in some space for you, as well as the lyre leaf sage. Like the other salvias we talked about, this one does have a little bit of a fragrance to the leaf, but the leaf is more spatulate. So it's going to be flat up against the ground and kind of a like a upside down U shape to it. And the flower on it is absolutely beautiful too. It comes right out of the ground in that salvia style where it has blooms all the way around the flower stalk. Spiderwort is the plant that you're seeing in the picture right next to you, that little blue flower. Spiderwort's another one like the blue-eyed grass that it starts to bloom in early spring, late winter. And it oftentimes grows in the medians of like US 1 or some of these areas that just kind of get mowed occasionally. So this is one that you could use as a ground cover if it was planted densely, and you can mow it, but oftentimes it will appear in other people's lawns, and they just mow over it when they are ready to mow, honestly. But one that, like the sunshine mimosa, only blooms throughout the morning time. So you're going to find that your pollinators visit this first thing in the morning, as well as your sunshine mimosa. And then as those flowers fade, they go find other nectar. Another fun thing about the, you don't have to go back to it, but another fun thing about the spiderwort is the leaves can be used in edible purposes. They're considered a potherb, and as well as the flowers can be used as a dye. So if you go out there in the morning and you find these flowers that have spent their flower for the day, you'll find if you squeeze it, a nice indigo color dye will come out on your fingers. So, all right, so using wildflowers in another sense is kind of creating a semi-wildflower meadow. So bringing in a lot of pollinator plants that benefit different species of pollinators. We have over 20 different species of bees that are native to Florida, not even considering our European honeybees that we're also fond of. But you're going to be attracting not only all these bees, but you're going to be attracting butterflies, you're going to be attracting birds, and in attracting the butterflies, you're going to be creating host plants where these birds sometimes will benefit from caterpillars and things like that. Not just that, but seed as well. So again, once we plant these plants like our ground covers, I usually say upon establishment, there's no need for irrigation. So that basically, depending on the time of the year, may mean hand watering if you don't have an irrigation system for roughly about 2 weeks, just to get these plants in the ground, get them rooted, and after that, they're really off to the races. So the minimal maintenance that would need to be done would be some hand weeding here and there. You know, it's oftentimes the hardest thing with wildflower gardens is for customers or just gardeners to realize what these small wildflowers are looking like when they're reseeding. Like the red sage that you see in front of you is one that readily reseeds within a wildflower bed. So being able to establish these in the right spot, you know, if you see a seedling that's going to be too close to the walkway, go ahead and pull it. Or, you know, if you just have 200 seedlings within a square foot of space, then you need to thin those out. That's the main maintenance with wildflower meadows. Or you can just let it go and just have a ton of flowers. And aesthetic value. So personally, you know, I think that what you see in front of you is a little bit more aesthetically pleasing than the green lawn that's across the street there at the neighbor's house. So, all right, we'll talk about a couple of these here in just a second. So one of my favorites is Gaillardia pulchella, or blanket flower. Gaillardia is a genus of wildflowers that grows around the Southeast United States. Pulchella is the species that grows native here. It has a low mounding habit, roughly about a foot to 18 inches, sometimes 2 feet if it's unmanaged, and then about 2 feet wide. It's an absolute favorite for the pollinators, just providing nectar. It's not a source for anything. So you'll see, like in this picture, this is a seed grown wildflower. So it has some genetic variation between the colors on the flowers. So seeing that there's yellow blooms on the same plant, whereas there's all red blooms. Oftentimes they'll have a mix of the two within the flower. You may be familiar with this flower from some of the old Florida state wildflower license plates that you might see around. Some of you may have those as well. So this is really a great wildflower. It can grow right in the cracks on A1A, so it can get abused basically and still be a great plant for you. Soil versatile, so you don't have to have that sandy soil, but that is what it prefers. Very salt tolerant plant, like I said. It can just be growing wild on A1A and just get blasted with salt air. So this is a great one if you're our beachside. It is a long-lived annual, so it will have roughly about a 9-month lifespan, give or take, when you bought the plant at what size it was. And from there, it readily reseeds within the yard. So you'll find that it pops up sometimes in the same spot, sometimes in a spot next to it. But what we like to do on our wildflower maintenance accounts is sometimes we'll take some of those dead heads or just some of those seeds and drop them in places that we'd like to see them sprout up for the next cycle. All right, back to this yard again. So this is dune sunflower. A lot of you may be familiar with it, like the blanket flower. It grows wild on A1A and on the dunes. It's Helianthus debilis. We do actually have 2 native species, subspecies of Helianthus debilis in Florida. One's referred to as East Coast, one's referred to as West Coast. So the East Coast is the one that obviously we want to be sourcing. The East Coast dune sunflower has a really blanketed habit. It doesn't get taller than about 9 inches, but you can see in this picture, I think we have 2 or 3 plants planted. So it can get about 8 to 10 feet wide if you let it. This is one that it doesn't root right on that stem, so it can be cut back in a certain way if it's getting too close to a walkway or up against something to where it shouldn't be. But this is another long-lived annual. So sometimes you can get a couple years out of these plants. Sometimes if it's not in a good location and it's been cut back a few times, that may require you pulling it a little earlier than it maybe could go. It's one that the pollinators absolutely love, everything from the bees to the butterflies. And because it does have that kind of dense thicket, things like birds like hiding down in there as well. So it's a great one if you're beachside that can take a lot of sun, can take that dry sandy soil and very little water. So this is a fun one. Some of you may have seen this one blooming recently. I actually found a wild patch of it in Melbourne on US 1, just kind of near where the car dealerships are, just on the bank though, that really steep bank on US 1. It's dotted horseman, aka bee balm, spotted bee balm. It's Monarda punctata. So Monarda is a genus of wildflowers that is throughout the country in different areas. The species is what's important, the punctata. So this is one that's an absolute pollinator magnet. You are going to have all varieties of pollinators like to visit this one. It's a beautiful little bloom, has a fragrance to it that's a little bit deeper than the sages, I would say, but it can be used as a pother for teas or cooking if you'd like to. Mostly blooms in the fall season. We've been lucky enough in certain accounts to have it blooming earlier and earlier, but it will last through about November, and then that same wildflower, it's considered a perennial, so you can cut that all the way back and it will vegetate out and keep on vegetating for the next year's bloom cycle. So this is one that would get about 3 to 4 feet, so it's more of kind of a specimen wildflower. You know, you're not going to plant a whole yard of this just because it would be a little tougher to walk through. They can get about 2 to 3 feet wide as well. So really just kind of the right location for this one can eat up a lot of space if you plan it accordingly. So this is one of our favorites, though, one of the most spectacular blooms on some of the native wildflowers. All right, don't let this common name scare you, tick seed. It's our state wildflower, Coreopsis. In Brevard County, we often find Coreopsis leavenworthii, which is what you see pictured here, as well as Coreopsis floridana. We have, I think, roughly over 20 native species of Coreopsis throughout the state of Florida, and thus it's our state wildflower. It prefers a moist area, so oftentimes some of these retention areas that get mowed find that Coreopsis or tick seed finds its way in there. And oftentimes if they're not mowed for a long time at a certain time of the year, you will see these blooms. It reseeds really readily. So if this is one that you plant in your yard, you will find that it's going to find its own way throughout your yard in an ideal situation. So it's not always going to stay in that same footprint of where you originally planted it, but it will find its way usually to the more low-lying areas of the property. But it does prefer full sun. It is a nice little bloom. That bloom there is probably about the size of a nickel, so it's not very big, but they can get about 2 feet tall or so, and a little bit, they're not a dense bloom, so it's a little bit leggy looking, but planted amongst other wildflowers, it looks really nice. Is an important source of nectar as well for our native pollinators. All right, so again, like the Monarda and the Coreopsis and the Gaillardia, this genus of wildflower, Liatris is found throughout the United States, commonly referred to as gay feather, but the species that grows native here in Brevard County is spicata, Liatris spicata. And we also find Liatris gracilis growing as well. In landscaping, we tend to use the spicata more. It just has a little bit more, I guess, aesthetic value to it. The blooms are just typically a lot bigger and showier, but not to say that gracilis doesn't have an important part in ecological landscapes. It's not very salt tolerant, but that last photo is in Cocoa Beach, right on a canal. So it can grow beachside. Don't let that fool you. The blooms that you see there, that's one just beginning, and you can see most of the year it's going to have these grass blades underneath it, and it will just look like a grass. Its main energy is in a corm underneath the ground, similar to like a banana or like some of these tubers. So it may go completely dormant in the winter, and then in early spring start to send some of these little blades up in its spot. Then in the late spring, summer, it'll start to send up these spikes, and those spikes will develop little blooms all the way around them. So this is one that it's a beautiful bloom, and it's also a very attractive plant for pollinators as well. All right. So this is one of my favorites. This is another pollinator magnet called seaside goldenrod. And we're talking about the upright plants in your photo, just on the top of the bank there. So seaside goldenrod is another genus of plants that's found throughout the United States in wildflower communities. Solidago sempervirens is the seaside goldenrod. We also often find Solidago chapmani, named after Chapman, who was a botanist, and so that's Chapman's goldenrod. This seaside goldenrod is going to like a wet spot. It can take a dry spot as well, but it has these large spatulate leaves that are going to stay in that same footprint for a few years, and from that base, it's going to send up what I like to refer to as spikes. They're not thorny or anything, but these flower spikes throughout the season until they open, and typically they open this time of year. So September through November, December, you're going to be seeing your goldenrod, even sometimes into January. So these are an absolute pollinator magnet. You're going to find all sorts of pollinators on these. More of kind of a specimen wildflower, because you can see it does get tall. So you're going to want to kind of plan accordingly with that. But it can do shade, it can do full sun. And really it's just a beautiful plant. Kind of reminds me of fireworks a little bit when it's blooming in full bloom. So this is one that oftentimes gets misunderstood. Folks feel that they might have allergies to goldenrod. It actually has no allergen compounds. Oftentimes ragweed is really what they're thinking of, the ambrosias, and especially like in the Midwest and things. Goldenrod has no allergen compounds to it. It's really that ambrosia family, so not the solidago. So if you do have allergies, then you're fine with this, but I would stay away from the coastal ambrosia that we talked about a few slides ago. All right, so if you have a lot of turf grass and you say, well, you know, I don't know if I want that many wildflowers, maybe I want like a cleaner look, or you just got a brand new pool put in, what should we do around it? There's ways to make your yard functional, which is one of the most important parts, while still providing some of these sustainable approaches to your landscape. So you want to use a permeable ground replacement in lieu of turf if you're able to. You know, pavers look great, but oftentimes they just have the water rush right off of them, and if there's things built up on the pavers, sometimes that's not good. So having a ground aggregate that's going to be permeable is very important, also to the structure of your home or other buildings on the property. So in this photo we used a washed shell. They're maybe about 1/4 of an inch, most of these shells, and used a flagstone as the walkway in between. It's a Mojave blend flagstone, 3-inch thick. And then around the property line, we just used some natural pine bark. It's important to use some of the pine mulches because they are some of the most sustainable mulch sources. They're also not dyed, so you don't have to worry about red dye number 5 working its way into the lagoon, amongst other dyes. You know, when you work with these dyed mulches, as many of you may know, you know, it ends up on your hands or your gloves. So, you know, in a nice rain, that dye is going to wash out, and then over time, you're going to say, well, my mulch is not red anymore, so I guess I need more mulch. When really, that mulch hasn't completely composted. You're really just putting it down for the aesthetic value of the red, which with these pines, they have a nice hue of brown to them, and it's a natural kind of reddish brown, and they don't lose their color for a long time because they're not dyed. It's just their natural color. And the larger of a pine bark nugget you use, the longer it takes to break down and compost. So theoretically, you may not have to put down any more mulch for months to years. So we've seen large pine bark nuggets last 5 years on some of these accounts before needing more. Pine straw is another good use of the sustainable mulch. The pine straw just naturally falls off in the pine rows during production and is just baled up. The thing about pine straw is it's not going to last quite as long as the pine bark nuggets would. So this is better for areas that, let's say, don't have a lot of weed pressure, or just maybe having more natural look to them already. But if you have pine trees on your property, utilize your pine straw. It's free mulch, and it really just helps build up that soil with nutrients and things as it breaks down. So really, if you're going to use mulch in an area for wildflowers or for planting beds, try to stick towards something that's at least not dyed, if not a pine product. And then if you're going to use some sort of aggregate like stone or anything, try to use this stone or coquinas or things that are going to be permeable, and also use those in areas that you aren't going to have plantings, because these stones can reflect light. They really don't provide any nutrients as they break down, and oftentimes can build up calcium on plants' roots. So if you do have any plants that are in wash shell, for instance, it needs to be something that can take a high amount of calcium, something that would naturally be growing in shell. So in this particular yard, we actually did plant Florida thatch palms that grow in very rocky areas and limestone in South Florida. So we do have some of those planted in there, but there's really not a lot of stuff that likes that calcium buildup. So in conclusion, you can kind of see our dune sunflower getting overtaken by some coastal ambrosia there in the front yard. But in conclusion, in reducing your turf, you're going to have a positive impact in the lagoon, whether that's a couple hundred square feet or your whole front yard. The little bit that you can provide back to native pollinators and native wildlife is going to benefit not only you for being able to see all these birds and things like that, but it's going to help those critters out and help our lagoon out in return. So use native ground covers and wildflowers. Try to stick with the native species that are going to be more bulletproof than some of the other ones that you might find in other stores or from other countries and things. So, and that's also going to be the ideal plants for our native pollinators. So in doing this in a big way or in a small way, you're going to be able to create habitat and help save our lagoon. So I know I have down below, grab one of our cards. This was from an in-person event, but feel free to visit the website down at the bottom, changeofgreenery.org, or you can follow us on Instagram if you're on there. And if you guys have any questions, I can take some of those now. We'll try to make it one at a time if we can, or we can even jump into the chat bar if necessary. So yeah, thank you guys very much.
Thank you so much, Skip. That was awesome. Such good information. Really appreciated everything you shared.
Thank you.
And a big thank you to Indian Harbor Beach Club. What am I saying wrong here? Garden Club. I'm missing the word garden. For finding Skip and bringing him to us for our presentation today. So thank you. We do want to open this up for some Q&A right now. Let's just see how we can do this. If you have a question, maybe just unmute yourself. Lydia, maybe I can unmute you. Let's try it. Let's see. Find you first. See you, but I can't unmute it.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Okay, I have a couple of questions and I have one comment.
Sure.
My first question is, of the ground covers that you talked about, you mentioned that some of them could be mowed. Which of them cannot be mowed?
So really the ones that shouldn't be mowed is more of the river sage, coastal ambrosia, and most of the wildflowers that I mentioned. So like the dune sunflower, blanket flower, you know, all the others, even including the river sage and things, can be weed whipped if they're getting too close to a sidewalk. So for instance, the coastal ambrosia, if it gets too close to the sidewalk, you can easily snip it or hit it with the weed whip in order to get it back in check.
Okay, my second question relates to the aggregates. I have a couple of beds that I inherited that have stone in them, and they are just absolutely weedy all the time. I have to weed them. So the aggregates that you listed here, do they have the same issues if they're next to areas that get mowed, in that they will have weeds that you have to pull?
Good question. So the more open surface area that you have for soil to build up from being mowed and things like that between the rocks, the more chance you are going to have things that are going to sprout through seed distribution. So mainly like nutsedges and things like that find their way into cracks in between the rocks. So having a flatter aggregate is oftentimes better, but it's not a weed-free solution. You know, having a landscape fabric under aggregates does help a lot. If depending on how weedy the situation is, sometimes we'll fabric underneath wildflowers and ground covers, but for the aggregate, it's really important to have a permeable landscape fabric as well. So some of these landscape fabrics that you see in nurseries that have they're black with, you know, kind of a thick fabric, oftentimes the water just beads off of that, and that can in turn find pockets within your aggregate to build up soil and then have a spot for seeds to germinate and things. So I would say you're less likely to have a ton of weed pressure in a like crushed coquina base versus like pea gravel or river rock or things like that, but it still is, I guess, susceptible to weed pressure, depending on your fabric situation, how much you have build up in there, and how many seeds are getting dispersed within that aggregate section.
Okay, and then last thing about the transdechia, is that how you say that?
Tradescantia, yeah, the spider wort.
Okay, all right. I have had that, not here, not in Florida, but I've had it elsewhere.
Sure.
And my concern is what happened where it appeared all over the yard. And if I didn't get it up, it formed a root ball that was just impossible if it got too big. So if anybody's thinking about using that, I'd be really, really careful because it was awful.
Yeah, you definitely want to plan accordingly, but what it will do oftentimes too, I've seen situations where I've planted one or two and it will create, you know, maybe like a 3 by 6 foot, you know, section, because they do grow like an iris would, you know, from underground. They have their stolons that they send underground and then pop back up. So it can reseed as well. So it kind of propagates in multiple different ways. So yeah, definitely you want to be kind of aware of any of these wildflowers as far as their growth habit and where you want to put it. But if it is in a situation where you don't have to walk on it or work with it too much, it's very carefree. You know, it requires very low maintenance, and you get blooms for roughly about 9 months of the year. So pollinators greatly benefit from that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Skip, we had a few questions in the chat too. Does anyone else have a question?
Try to address the top one about for grasses invading hardscapes and ground covers. What we do when we plant our ground covers, like for instance, when we plant sunshine mimosa, we will start with a very clean base. You know, we'll get out there and we'll grade it. We'll clean it up from any weeds that are currently there or any grasses. And then depending on the situation, if it's really weedy and we just really want that mimosa to get started quick, sometimes we'll lay a very permeable landscape fabric where water can bead through and roots can penetrate. And then we'll top that with a fine pine bark nugget so that there's more surface area for that mimosa to send its roots through. And then it can root through the mulch, through the fabric. And that's actually what we did in this Riverside account you see behind me. And we plant those mimosas roughly at about 3 feet on center and stagger the way we lay them out so that they can fill in the gaps. But even when doing that, we still have to pull some nutsedge, you know, between the ground covers until it gets established. And then upon permanent maintenance, you know, there's still going to be things that find their way into ground covers or into hardscapes. So I wish there was a cure-all, but really just hand weeding most of this stuff is what we end up doing. We don't have a spray license. I don't believe in a spray program for what we do. I've worked in several greenhouses where all I was doing all day was spraying chemicals. So, you know, I've really tried to move away from that and starting this business. So we try to take everything from a hands-on approach when it comes to weed maintenance, pest control, things like that. So If you start with a good landscape fabric, though, oftentimes you can get ahead of it and then at least give your ground covers or your hardscape some time before you have to get out there and find where it is. But even just spending, an hour a month out there can really help. Yeah, so if you're interested in consultations or anything, I'll put my phone number up here. But we do have our website, changeofgreenery.org, with my phone number on there as well. And our cards are up at Rockledge Gardens as well as a few other local nurseries. But I'll go ahead and put my contact info in here. And usually what we do is we like to come out and see an area and do a consultation that either lasts somewhere between 30 minutes to an hour. And we do full designs, full landscape design, and we also do the installation. I myself do the consultations and take charge of the installations and things like that too. So you would see my face.
Okay, some of the other questions, I think you got them. So you don't have a nursery per se.
Well, actually we do. We have a nursery that we lease a property across the street from Rockledge Gardens. We are by appointment only because we are on landscape jobs and things all the time. And we're a small crew of about, currently we're only 4 people. And one of those people is my fiance, who we just had a baby a month or 2 ago. So she's kind of out of commission at the moment. So by appointment is the best way to do it. If you call the number below that I put on there, we can always schedule a time to meet you out there. We grow a lot of things for our job. So some of these ground covers that I mentioned, I know I have river sage and sunshine mimosa and a few of those others, as well as some fruits that we grow too. I have 2 varieties of bananas, figs, not avocados, but pineapple, sugarcane, gingers, so some funky stuff as well. But we're all about, if we're not feeding the birds or the pollinators, we can at least feed ourselves with some of our landscape. So very important in a pandemic to grow a little bit of your own food.
Yes, I agree. Okay, Dawn has a question. Did I unmute you, Dawn?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can, yes.
Okay. So I'm sorry if I missed it. I'm wondering what it costs to get an evaluation and a plan.
Yeah, so we kind of have an incentive-based program. So what we do is, if you just wanted to have me out to kind of pick my brain and kind of get some ideas for doing things on your own, I charge $75 for a consultation. But what I do is, if we end up doing a design for you, we would basically waive the consultation fee, and then we would work on the design. That rate would be applied to design hours. And let's say I spent 2 hours working on a design, so at $75 an hour, roughly $150 for a design. And then from there, if you said, oh, this is a great plan, let's go for it, let's set up a time, then I would waive that design fee and we would just go ahead and get started. But what I would do is, if you said, okay, let me just kind of get a few more quotes or something like that, then we would charge for the design. And then if you came back to us and wanted to get going, we would return that design fee upon completion of the project. So let me know if that's not clear.
Oh, that's awesome.
No, that's clear. And
I get lost in my own sentences. So
the sky's the limit, what it could cost to change the ground cover.
Depends on the scope of the project. So that's kind of how we lay it out with, how much time are we putting into the planning. And with your plan, you would get not only the visual design, but you would get the estimate, including quantity of plants, the plant species that I select, the price that those would be. And then I would price out all the materials, all the planting labor, initial cleanup labor, and things like that too. So.
Okay, could you give me like a crazy idea what something could cost?
Well,
if it came to fruition.
We do big and small jobs. So, we do jobs that are less than $1,000 sometimes. We do jobs that are over $10,000 sometimes. So
Okay.
It really just depends on, what all you want to get done. But yeah, the sky's the limit with us. We're happy to do whatever works. But sometimes the smaller jobs are just as rewarding to be able to make a bigger impact in small areas. So, but yeah, it really just depends, so if you kind of think, it all depends on the area that you'd like to kind of have service. So if I'm only designing a small portion, then that design fee is going to be pretty small as well, and so on and so forth.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, anybody else have any questions for Skip? So Skip did say, and I don't know if you still have time to do that, that he would stick around for a little while. If you think of something and want to ask him later, pop it in the chat. He can get to you that way, or call and set up your consultation with him. So once again, thank you so much. That was a great presentation. Really.
Thank you guys. I really appreciate it. I'm happy to speak to all these folks, and maybe one day we'll get together in person and do it again.
Yeah, definitely. That'd be great. So we had 30 participants, at 33 at one point that were on. So pretty nice audience for you today.
Awesome. Awesome. I appreciate everyone. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you. Big quiet round of applause. Everybody's muted.